In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about the events module, particularly the Event Emitter class within the events module. Now, all the events module allows us to do is basically bring event-driven programming to Node.js. So to get started, we're going to actually have to require the event module. Now the events module is actually built into Node.js. So I'm just going to say const event emitter. Now this is going to be the class that we get from requiring from the event module. I'm just going to say equal require event. Now from here, we're going to have to create a new instance of the event emitter. So I'm just going to say const event emitter. I'm going to say new event emitter. So from here, we're going to start getting into event-driven programming. Now that I have my event emitter object, let's actually attach a listener to it. So I'm just going to say event emitter, and I'm going to call the method on. Now, this method takes on two arguments. One is the listener that you want to attach to this object. So I'm just going to call it tutorial for this example. And the second argument is going to be the function that you want to execute when this tutorial event occurs. So let's just pass in this function. And all I'm going to say is console.log tutorial event has occurred. So now if I save this and run it, so I'm just going to hit Control S to save. And I'm just going to say node app. You can see that nothing happens within our terminal. Now why is that? Well, I have this object. I've attached a listener called tutorial, but I haven't emitted a tutorial event. Remember, this code here is only going to be executed when a tutorial event occurs. So now let's emit a tutorial event. So I'm just going to say event emitter. And now I'm just going to pass in tutorial as the first argument. And that's it. So now if I was to hit Control S to save, and now execute this one more time, you can see that our tutorial event gets triggered whenever we call the emit method. So now what happens when we actually want this function to have parameters? Well, I could give it parameters, so I could say num1, num2. And just for argument's sake, so just to show on the console, we're going to print out the sum of num1 and num2. So now how would I call it down here with the emit method? Well, I'll just pass it in as an argument. So I could pass in 1 and 2. So if I save this now, and now go to Node app, you can see that we get the value of 3. So you just pass in the arguments. Now this is all fine and dandy, but how would I create a custom object which takes advantage of using events? Well, I could just inherit from the Event Emitter class. So, for example, let's say that I want to create a person class. So I say class person, and I could just extend from the Event Emitter class. And now from here, let's give it a constructor. Now let's call our super function. So I'm just going to say super. And this is going to allow us to use the this property within our class. And now I'm just going to say this dot underscore name is going to be assigned value of name. And now let's actually pass in name to our constructor. And now let's give this person class a getter. So I'm just going to say get name. And all this is going to do is just return this dot underscore name. So now that we have our person class defined, let's actually create a new instance of it. So I'm just going to go down here and I'm just going to say let Pedro equal new person. And let's pass in Pedro. And now here, remember, when I say new person, person extends the Event Emitter class, which means that Pedro is also an instance of the Event Emitter class. So now I can add a listener to the Pedro object. So I could just say Pedro.on. And I'm just going to call it name. And we're going to pass in our function. And I'm just going to print out my name is so-and-so. So I'm just going to say console.log my name is, and we're just going to say Pedro.name. So now that we've attached our listener, obviously we're going to have to call the emit method. So we're going to emit the event has occurred. So I'm just going to say Pedro.emit. And we're going to pass in name. And now if I was to save this and now execute this, you can see that we get the desired output of my name is Pedro. So that's how you would extend using the Event Emitters class. And for our final example, let's say that we have more than one person object. So I'm just going to create a new person. I'm just going to call, let's make it a girl. I'm just going to call her Christina. I'm going to say new person. And we're going to pass in Christina. Now let's add a listener to the Christina object. So I'm just going to say Christina.on name. And you could use a loop for this, but since I'm only creating two person objects, it doesn't make sense for this example, but you can use a loop to do this all in one shot. And we are just going to copy this. paste this in here. And I'm just going to say Christina dot name. All right, so why did I go through the bother of showing you that we created 2 person objects and attached listeners to it? Well, what I want to show you is that when you emit an event to occur, the event gets executed synchronously. So for example, if I say Pedro and then I say Christina, and now if I was to save this and now execute it, you can see that these get executed synchronously. So because Pedro emitted first, Pedro gets executed first, and then our Christina object. So they get executed in the order that they emitted in. So they execute synchronously. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about the readLine module. Now, what the readLine module allows us to do is prompt the user as well as get user input. So to get started, we're going to have to require the module. So I'm just going to say const readLine is equal to require readLine, and this is going to bring in our readLine module. Next, we're going to have to create an instance of the readLine interface by using the create interface method. So I'm just going to say readLine.create interface, and within here is going to take an object. Now we're going to give this object 2 properties, and this is basically our configuration file. So the first property I'm going to give it is input, and then we're going to give it an object. Now this object is called process. Now process is a global object, so you don't have to require it. It's already given to us by node. And then here we're going to say std in. Now input is going to be the std in input stream. And then here we obviously need an output. So I'm just going to say output, and we're going to give it process.std out, and that's going to stand for output stream. Now when this method is executed, it's going to return our readLine interface object. So let's save it inside a variable so we can use it. So I'm just going to say const rl is equal to this. Now let's say I want to ask the user what 2 numbers added together are equal to. So for this example, I'm just going to generate 2 random numbers between 1 and 10. So I'm just going to say let num1 equal math.floor math.random, and we're going to times this by 10, and we're going to shift it over by 1. So this is going to give us a random number between 1 and 10. Let's copy this twice, paste it, 2, and we need the answer. So I'm just going to say let answer equal num1 plus num2. All right. So now that we have this, we're ready to ask the user what these 2 numbers are equal to. Now in order to do that, I'm going to use our readline interface, and our readline interface has a method called question. So I'm going to say rl question. Now the first argument is going to be a string. The second argument is going to be a function. And basically the first argument is going to be the question we would like to ask the user. So I'm just going to say backtick, what is num1 plus num2? Question mark. And I'm just going to hit enter here because I want you guys to see this on one line. And we're going to include our callback. Now this function is going to get the user input as a parameter. So I'm just going to say user input. And for now, I'm just going to print out user input onto the console, just so you guys can see that it's actually working. So now if I was to save this, head over to my console, type node app. It's going to say what is 4 plus 2. I'm going to say banana. And there you go. It prints out the user's input. It's important to note that if you take a look at our console, the application is still running. So I'm just going to hit Control C to break out of it. And what we need to do is actually close the readline interface when we're done using it. So in order to do that, let's actually add a couple of things. First thing, I want a new line right after this question mark here. So I'm just going to say /n. So when I prompt the user's input, instead of lining up right next to it, like so, is going to be underneath. Alright, so I fixed that problem. Next thing I want to do is actually test the user input to see if he actually got the answer correct. So in order to do that, I'm just going to say if user input, and it's always important to trim the user's input if you ever accept anything from a user, just to get rid of the trailing white space. And we're just going to say if the user's input is equal to answer. So if they answer the math question correctly, I want to close the application. So I could say rl.close. And here. And now if I was to save this and now execute the program, so I'm just going to write node app is going to say what is 10 plus 4, and I'm going to answer with 14. And you can see that we answered it correctly, and therefore our application closed. Now what I want to do is actually add a listener to the close event. Now the readline interface is actually an instance of the EventEmitter Class. So what we can do is actually scroll down here and I'll add it towards the end. And I want to say rl.on, and basically I'm going to say, hey, I want you to listen for an event to occur, and I'm going to say close, and we're going to give it a callback, and this function is only going to execute when we close the read line interface. So now I'm just going to say console.log, and basically I just want to let the user know that, hey, you got the correct answer. So I'm just going to say correct. So now if I was to save this and now execute it, node app, what is 6 plus 3? I'm just going to write 9. You can see that correct gets printed out onto the console. Now, correct gets printed out onto the console because when we use the method close, it emits the close event. And since we're listening for a close event, this callback function gets executed. And on that note, I better add a semicolon on there. And let's save that. So now that we handled what happens when the user inputs correctly, what happens if the user gets the wrong answer? So in order to do that, let's create an else statement within our question method here. So I'm just going to say else, and what I want to do basically is reprompt the user. So I'm just going to say rl.prompt.setPrompt, and setPrompt is basically going to take an argument of string and it's going to ask the user basically what you want to know. So I'm going to say to the user, incorrect response, please try again. And let's add a new line here. And now in order to use the prompt, I actually have to call it. So the first method is to set the prompt. The second method is going to be to call it. So I'm just going to say rl prompt. So now I'm just going to hit Control S to save. And now I'm just going to execute this. Node app. And it's going to say, what is 1 plus 5? And I'm going to say banana. And it's going to say, incorrect response, please try again. Now, I actually haven't told it what to do once the user inputs. So let's actually write the code for that now. And what I'm going to do is actually add a listener to our read line interface. So I'm going to listen for the user's input, and the event for that is rl.onLine, and then we're going to pass it in a callback. Now this callback is going to have the user's input. And now we're going to decide what to do once we get the user's input. So obviously what we want to do is check if the user's input is correct. And if it is correct, we are going to close the application. And now what happens if it isn't correct? We're going to say else. And then I'm going to reset the prompt. So I'm just going to say rl.setPrompt. And I'm going to say, let's actually make this more informative. So I'm just going to say your answer of, and then we're just going to print out what they wrote. User input is incorrect. And we're going to do a /. And before that, I'm just going to say try again. So now let's end that. And now remember, once we set the prompt, we actually have to call it. So now I'm just going to say rl.prompt. And now if we just take a look at what we have so far, this is basically going to give us a loop. So we set a line event listener. Now when the user enters input, that's going to trigger this line input. We're going to test to see if what he gave us is correct, and if it is, we're just going to close the application. And if we close the application, this onClose method is going to execute. It's going to say correct. So now let's see what happens if we give it the wrong value. It's going to execute the else statement. It's going to set the prompt. Your answer of so-and-so is wrong. And then it's going to prompt the user again. And basically, this line event is going to keep executing until the user enters the correct input. So let's actually take a look at this in action. So I'm just going to clear the terminal, and before I execute, let me just save. Control S to save. Oops. Control S to save. And now I'm just going to hit node app. And it's going to say, what is 1 plus 4? And I'm going to say banana. Incorrect response. Please try again. I'm going to type banana again. Your answer banana is not correct. And you can see that this will go on indefinitely. Now if I go back up and let's actually see what it was. What is 1 plus 4? So I'm just going to type in 5. And you can see we get the output of correct, and then it exits the application.